All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday night chats, Rev War Revelry. Tonight, we're talking about Nathanael Greene, the quartermaster, especially his time there at Valley Forge when he does become quartermaster. We are joined tonight by Daniel Davis. He's a historian. He is an educator. He is the senior educator right now for the American Battlefield Trust. You've probably seen him giving pop-up tours around Virginia, most notably at Yorktown. And he is also the author of numerous books and studies on the American Civil War. So Dan, thank you for joining us tonight on our next installment of Emerging Rev War Revelry.
Hey, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So tonight we're talking about someone that Dan and I have had many chats about, Nathanael Greene, and about Valley Forge and so forth. So we're excited to dive into it because Nathanael Greene once wrote that you've never heard of a quartermaster in history. And so tonight we're actually going to give Nathanael Greene his due diligence. And so prior to that, though, Nathanael Greene, though, is there from almost the first shots right after Lexington and Concord. He is unique. He is born into a Quaker family who are pacifists, but he is obviously enamored by the militia. Dan is going to show a portrait there of the young Nathanael Greene strapping there. Do you want to talk about the picture real quick that you just threw up there, Dan?
Yeah, I think this is, Greene probably in his heyday, as depicted during his time in the Southern campaign. I think we remember Greene more so for his conduct and his actions in the Carolinas, 1780 to 1782. But he really cuts his teeth and really comes into his own as a quartermaster. And you could probably argue that his time in the Carolinas in the Southern campaign, he doesn't have that without his time as the quartermaster general of the Continental Army.
No, you're exactly right. But he got used to horses and wagons, let's not put the horse in front of the cart, move to the Southern Theater that quick. So Nathanael Greene initially does march off, I think, with the Kentish Guards. However, because of an incident earlier in his life, he does walk with a limp, so he's not martial enough to actually get an officer position. And he's actually sent home early prior to the American Revolution, but he returns in time, obviously, luckily for the Americans, to get a role, and he captures the eye of George Washington quickly up around the environs of Boston. He then rises through the ranks, becomes one of George Washington's most trusted subordinates. And if I believe, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't he? I think he gets sick during the New York campaign, unfortunately, at a very inopportune time for the American cause.
Yeah, he does get sick during the New York campaign. He does take a brief leave of absence. He is sick in the hospital. But you mentioned, that illness, Phil, and Greene is actually not in the best of health through much of his life. He suffered from asthma for much of his life. As you mentioned, he walked with a limp, which kept him from becoming an officer in the Kentish Guards, that militia unit that he helped form in Rhode Island. But I think, we, the people of the United States, have a debt of gratitude to the colony, or then the state of Rhode Island, who promote Greene from private to the rank of brigadier general in summer of 1775, putting Greene in a position of leadership. And we think, we go back to the Civil War, we think about Elon Farnsworth and George Custer and Wesley Merritt being promoted from captain to brigadier general on the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg. But Greene is promoted from private to brigadier general, ultimately to major general in the Continental Army. So I think, again, we probably, for Greene's service to the United States, we owe the Rhode Island General Assembly a debt of gratitude for that.
There you go. Shout out to the Rhode Island General Assembly. You don't usually hear that. A shout out to politics, but we're not straying too far down into that realm tonight. And of course, Nathanael Greene, like most of the American generals, their education did not obviously have a military education. They didn't go to a military academy. Actually, Nathanael Greene and Henry Knox probably knew each other. I mean, didn't Greene go into Knox's bookstore to actually purchase books and read and so forth before the war?
I have to go back and take a look at that, but Greene was a voracious reader. He had his own, as historian John Buchanan has detailed it, an eclectic library. He was, in fact, very fond of works in Latin, and he was really a self-taught individual because of his Quaker upbringing. His father, his family did not endorse Greene having an education outside of the Society of Friends, outside of the Quaker faith. But nonetheless, Greene grew up reading as much as he possibly could, both from the classical sense, but also from the military sense.
And that'll unfortunately sometimes get the worst of him as he comes back after a brief illness during that New York campaign that we mentioned a few minutes ago, because he does instruct George Washington to hold on to a fort there that's actually named in George Washington's honor. And it's actually one of the biggest debacles there at the end of the New York campaign, the loss of Fort Washington. I think about 3,000 soldiers are captured, including some of the men near to me to this flag above, some Maryland riflemen, Holland Williams being amongst them. But luckily, Greene is able to, like Washington, understand those mistakes, and he actually kind of becomes wiser from them. Would you agree, Dan?
Yeah, I do agree. And Fort Washington is just tagging off that just a little bit. Fort Washington is a crushing defeat on the heels of a campaign in which the British under Sir William Howe had pushed Washington and the Continental Army out of New York. They've captured New York City. And not only, as Phil mentioned, there's a number of men captured, but also munitions, provisions, ammunition. It's a crushing blow to the Continental Army. And Washington actually decides to hold the fort against probably his better judgment, but because Greene insists that the fort can withstand a heavy British assault, which when it does not, it falls within roughly about 6 to 8 hours. The fighting takes roughly about the entire day in the middle of November of 1776. But it's there that, Greene, right after the fall of Fort Washington, he writes to Henry Knox that he's sad, vexed, sick, and sorry, something along those lines. So it's a devastating defeat, not only for Washington, Continental Army, for Greene, both personally and professionally, but it's after the fall of Fort Washington that Greene begins, he starts to begin to dabble a little bit in the role of a quartermaster general, which I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously as we get into and later on, and what that position is or was in the 18th century, but their responsibilities. He begins, as Washington begins pulling out of New York, pulling across New Jersey, eventually into Pennsylvania, prior to the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Greene begins to oversee and put together magazines or depots, forage depots, supply depots for the Continental Army to subsist on as Washington begins to pull out of and across New Jersey to subsist the army, or what's really at that point in time, what's left of the Continental Army after the end of the New York campaign.
And it's true. Not only does he dabble in that, he also brings to the forefront Thomas Paine, who is actually marching in his depleted division, and obviously writes the famous American Crisis. This is the time. Yeah, these are the times to try men's souls. So Nathanael Greene, though, does continue in a line command. So he's in charge of a division throughout the rest of course, 1776 and into 1777. He's with Washington throughout. He becomes probably if there would be after Charles Lee's captured there at Basking Ridge, probably Washington's left-hand man. Would you agree, Dan?
I would agree. I think by that point in time, despite what happens at Fort Washington, Washington, I think, sees a little bit of himself in Greene, and that Greene is a very ambitious, he's a rather young man, but he's also very ambitious from the military sense, which Washington certainly was, going back to his time as an officer in the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War. And I think that appeals to Washington a little bit. And despite the defeat in New York, despite the loss of Fort Washington, relationship continues to grow, especially during what we call the 10 crucial days, the battles of Trenton and Princeton, where Washington changes in 2 victories. He changes within the course of about 2 weeks the trajectory of the American Revolution. And Greene is right there at his side with him. So the two men they've established a relationship, but they start to build and continue to build a bond through those the end of 1776 and into 1777.
And then as they go into 77, one of the largest battles initially, obviously, the summer campaign, Washington is initially not completely sold on what the British offensive campaign will be. You have Burgoyne's army coming down and this campaign season of 1777. Howe eventually takes his army up and lands in Maryland, starts coming up into southeastern Pennsylvania, where they fight on September 11th of 1777, the largest, I think, per man or per unit or person, whatever you want to call it, battle along Brandywine Creek on September 11th. And Greene actually does play a role there. He's held in reserve, but his column does remove in remarkable speed. Some say he covers about 4 miles in 45 minutes to help buttress the American forces. So Greene is there once again throughout the beginning of the campaign of 1777. Obviously, his fights up through the next battle, Germantown, October of 1777, and then brings us into December. But before we get to White Marsh and the move to Valley Forge, Greene is acting as line command. Who is Quartermaster General? Who's occupying? I'm not saying he's doing the job, but who's occupying the post there in late 1777, Dan?
Yeah, that would be Thomas Mifflin. And he is the Quartermaster General of the Continental Army. Is he acting as the Quartermaster General should at Army headquarters as a staff position? No, he's in Philadelphia. Washington has kept him in Philadelphia through the course of the campaign because Mifflin is not only is he talented from a staff perspective, but he's also assisting with the Continental Army at a critical time with recruiting duties in Philadelphia. And before I think we go a little bit farther into what happens with Thomas Mifflin, I want to rewind a little bit back to Brandywine, because I think it's a Brandywine where Greene sees his redemption as a battlefield commander. As Phil mentioned, Greene fights a rear guard action that allows Washington's army to make it safely off the battlefield. They live to fight another day, which really becomes the mantra of the Continental Army, not only in the North, but as well as in the South, when Greene becomes commander of the Southern Department. But because of that rear guard action gives Greene, I think, a little bit of redemption, at least in not so much in Washington's eyes, but in his own eyes as a commander. Now, jumping back to Thomas Mifflin. Thomas Mifflin is in Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia is the target of Sir William Howe's offensive in the summer, early fall of 1777. Howe wants to either, one, capture Philadelphia, but more so he wants to destroy Washington's army. Philadelphia ultimately falls on September 26, 1777. Within just a few weeks, I'm going to pull an image of him up. It pains me to do this, but I'm going to show the folks an image of Thomas Mifflin. Mifflin is a major general in the Continental Army, and he is the Quartermaster General. Again, we'll get into what a Quartermaster General is in just a few minutes. But there is Thomas Mifflin on the screen. On October the 8th, this is a few weeks after the fall of Philadelphia. This is just a few days after the Battle of Germantown, where Greene plays, again, a rather significant, prominent role in Washington's effort to potentially recapture the capital. Thomas Mifflin tenders his resignation, but he doesn't tell George Washington. He goes home to Reading, Pennsylvania, and he just leaves. And if you take a look at this from the perspective of Washington, Washington is not only serving as a commander-in-chief, he's also serving as his own theater commander. He is the main defender of Philadelphia, the American capital, but he's also having to coordinate operations in the Northern Department with Major General Horatio Gates and what becomes, or what is, the Saratoga campaign. So Washington effectively is now in the middle of this major campaign, having to fill probably the most important role that a 18th century army can have in a quartermaster general, along with the fact that he's theater commander and he's also the commander in chief. And this is a heavy burden on Washington. Now, Mifflin, for what it's worth, he has some political connections in Congress, and he is actually able, despite resigning, he's actually able to keep his commission as a major general. And then he goes on to serve, I believe, on the Board of War. But at the same time, Congress, which is since had to flee Philadelphia, they don't appoint a quartermaster general until March of 1778. So the Continental Army, and this leads into what Phil has studied in detail in the Winter at Valley Forge. Without that quartermaster general, without that role being filled, the Continental Army goes into its winter encampment at Valley Forge without the person who's there to supply them with their basic needs. And this role goes unfilled for 4 months, which certainly, along with other factors, but certainly lends to the condition of the Army and what the Army has to deal with throughout the winter of 1777, 1778.
Yeah, very true. I mean, it's almost unfathomable to think that for almost 5 months, one of the most important positions logistically and behind the scenes for the Continental Army is not fulfilled at all and just kind of sits on the back burner. Prior to moving into the Valley Forge, so we do have a few good points. One we did gloss over is that, Greene does probably solidify his standing back at Brandywine after Fort Washington, but he also, thank you, John Miles, does do a yeoman service there at Trenton. And there's 10 crucial days, and Dan did mention that briefly. But a comparison that I've never heard made, and I know that this is a little early to bring in the other major conflict on American shores that happens about 75 years later, and that's the American Civil War. But someone said Washington and Greene's relationship is akin to U.S. Grant's and William T. Sherman's relationship. That's an interesting point. So I want to take a segue for a minute or two and kind of see what you think, Dan.
That's an interesting correlation. I think that might be the topic of another revelry later on down the road. The American Revolution comparisons to the Civil War. But also shout out, good to see you, John, in the chat. Hope all is well on your end, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think if what Sherman said, that if Grant stood beside me when I was drunk, or when I was crazy, I'll stand beside him when he's a drunkard. Maybe Washington said, hey, I'll stand beside Greene when he screwed up Fort Washington, as long as you stand beside me as we retreat out of Brandywine and give up Philadelphia. So not as catchy as Sherman's term, but maybe someone can come up with a better kind of adage there. But as we move in, of course, Mifflin goes home. And then the Army obviously marches in on December 19th down the Gulf Road. They end up at a place called Valley Forge, which ironically had actually been scoured of supplies earlier in the year by raid by Cornwallis, and I always mispronounce his name, the Hessian general Kniphausen or Kniphausen, how do you pronounce his name? But Washington chooses Valley Forge because of its strategic significance. It is close to Philadelphia. Washington had a tough decision to make. Do you give up the capital of the colonies, Philadelphia, or do you move and give up what is left of supply and munitions depots at like places like Reading and York in the interior of Pennsylvania? So he decides that the capital is not the important thing, and that continuing to keep the supplies, munitions safe, and also the interior of the country. And so he goes to Valley Forge. And so as we open up about Valley Forge, I don't want to, of course, take over the entire conversation, but as they march in, Dan, any insights on what the initial part of why Washington chooses Valley Forge, or what's going through his mind?
Yeah, I think with Valley Forge, and I'll borrow a little bit from our good friend Rick Herrera, just published a book on Valley Forge called Feeding Washington's Army. Washington chooses Valley Forge because, number one, as Phil mentioned, it's close to Philadelphia. But as Rick mentions, he chooses it and he looks at it from the modern perspective of forward operations base. It's at a location close to the enemy where you can project power. You can, and not only from the perspective of having an encampment, but sending out expeditions into the countryside to project power, project authority. It's on advantageous ground, it's on high ground. So if the British were to sally out of Philadelphia, Washington would certainly be have the defensive advantage should Howe decide to actually attack the encampment. And we see this as well from Greene's writings as they march in and toward the end of December, just before Christmas of 1777, the supplies they're in really bad shape. They are in need of not only supplies, food, but most importantly, winter clothing. They need, and they obviously will find, the supplies to ultimately build their winter huts. But the Continental Army is in really bad shape, and this is reflected in Greene's writings. If you have a chance to read his letters, they're in really bad shape once they arrive at Valley Forge.
No, you're exactly right. Even George Washington, I mean, some of the iconic images of that encampment is obviously him kneeling in the snow and praying, which he never did. But he does, throughout the war, I think he spends, some historians said about 10,000 pieces of correspondence emanates from his desk. Not all, of course, written by him. He does have a staff to do it as well. But December 23rd of 1777, so 4 days after coming into Valley Forge, Washington will actually sit at his desk. He's probably just about to move in or moved into Isaac Potts' house. And he writes a letter to the president of the Continental Congress, Henry Laurens. He says, "I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one of other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse, in order to obtain subsistence in the best manner that they can." A very, I mean, that's a shot across the bow to Lawrence and the Continental Congress. Like, and in case they didn't understand the importance, Washington underscores that by the next line saying, in quotes, "Sir, this is not an exaggerated picture, and that I have abundant reasons to support what I say." And so here you have an army marching in, and contrary to what public myth states, yes, Valley Forge is not the coldest winter. It's not doesn't have the most snowfall winter. That happens at Morristown the following year. And it's not like the surrounding area didn't have somewhat of an abundance of crops or produce or livestock or supplies to give. It's just that the Continental Congress, the Quartermaster Department, is in deplorable conditions. Jumping ahead slightly, Greene will say that I have not received any returns from General Mifflin, and therefore can only conjecture as to the full extent of our wants. This was on March 26. So as Greene takes over, the Quartermaster Department is in shambles. The public trust of the Quartermaster Department is also in shambles. And Continental Congress is more concerned with creating a board of war to look at Washington. And Washington is kind of caught between knowing that some of his dispatches coming out of Valley Forge, like the letter he just wrote, could have been intercepted by spies or scouts, or who knows who's filtering around the Continental Congress. And so you have this, that's the arena that I like to picture or paint for people late December into early January as the army marches into Valley Forge. All of that is taking place in this vacuum. And the dire result is, as this gets unfolded, the rank and file are the ones that are suffering.
Yeah, and what Washington needs at this point in time, and I think we've been going a long way around the barn. I think we should just get to the heart of the matter. He needs a quartermaster general. So the question becomes, in a very broad sense, what is a quartermaster general? Within the context of the 18th century, and obviously this has changed over the course of the last 250 years, but within the context of what Washington is looking for, is that a quartermaster general is essentially a staff position. It's a staff position very close to the commanding general. They were responsible. They had several different responsibilities depending on what other positions were filled around, but essentially they were, and this really speaks to Valley Forge and the winter encampment and the subsequent winter encampments, is that a quartermaster would locate and lay out an Army's camp. Well, what does that mean? Valley Forge is is on high ground. It's defensively advantageous. So ideally, you want to have someone who had an eye for terrain, but also a good eye for where the water is. How am I going to supply my men with water? In addition to that, they would mark out and delineate, choose the Army's line of march up to and including if they had creeks across, bridges had to be built, they would procure and distribute camp equipment and tents. Again, very important within the context of winter encampment, along with, to a certain degree, the tools that we use to build the winter huts that you see if you go to Valley Forge today, the reconstructed huts. But most importantly, and Phil kind of touched on this at the opening, when he said, don't put the horse before the cart or the cart before the horse. The Quartermaster General was responsible for the transportation of all supplies to the Army, which meant that they had to requisition and find carts, wagons, sleighs, whatever you could find, as well as the animals, oxen, the horses, to pull those carts and wagons, and along with the forage to feed them, to provide that to the Army. So it was a very heavy responsibility. And again, as we talked about, it was a responsibility that when Washington goes into a winter encampment, he does not have somebody in that position who is essentially responsible for laying out the encampment and providing supplies to the Army.
And that's good. And even as Greene, I mean, it takes months. You're looking November 1777, March of 1778, 4 months. As even when Washington, that letter he sends to Henry Lawrence does precipitate a committee in camp to come out. Washington is saying, look, come out and look at this army. And Gouverneur Morris actually says they're paraphrasing, it's an army of skeletons. I mean, it's to the point where when soldiers are going to the sick, the hospitals, the sick wards, whatever you want to call them, they're actually inventorying these soldiers' clothes because other soldiers are ready to pilfer the clothes when these guys go in to have amputations or treatments for smallpox. There are ones obviously that are looking at how do you, they're stewing stones to get the moss off of it. And what's ironic is that there are places along the way, because of mismanagement, there are depots that have food but no wagons, and there's places that there are wagons and no food. And so it's not like the country doesn't care, just you can't, with no head, you have all this stuff comes to a standstill. And I know it's 20 years ahead of time, but Napoleon will once say an army marches or fights on his stomach. Well, it also has to encamp at his stomach, and that is one of the necessary things that Washington has to draw that line with. And so, of course, he turns to Nathanael Greene, who is his left-hand man. And of course, Greene utters one of the most, I think, one of the coolest quotes ever. And we were doing this revelry partly because I wanted to make sure that he knew he went down in history. But it is that nobody ever heard of a quartermaster in history. Well, Dan, now Nathanael Greene can rest assured there in Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, that he has been heard in history.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I obviously do have a soft spot in my heart for Nathanael Greene. And Phil mentioned the committee in camp, and Greene is actually meeting with the committee in camp through the course of the end of January going into February. And things finally, and again, the Army's out without this key position going back to October. It's not until the second week of February that things really come to a head. There's, Phil mentioned the weather at Valley Forge. It's not as cold as the Morristown weather, but there is some pretty brutal weather around the second week of February. And the Army is, because of the poor weather, those wagons and supplies that can get through can't, because the roads are impassable. And so Greene, after meeting with the committee in camp, he sort of has an audition on the job, if you will. Washington's going to send him out for the better part of a week and a half, 2 weeks, into the surrounding countryside with a force. It's an expedition or grand forage to bring back whatever they can from the local population. Not so much, again, to try to help the Continental Army to survive, but Washington at the same time, he doesn't want these supplies, these potential supplies, to fall into the hands of the British who are sitting in Philadelphia. So for the better part of a week and a half, 2 weeks or so, maybe a week, Greene is out on a foraging expedition, and he writes, I think, very famously that it's a very brutal job to have to requisition or take these wagons, the cattle, horses, sheep, chickens, whatever he possibly can to feed the army from the local population. He wants to make sure that the local population supports Washington, supports the cause of independence. But he writes, again, famously, like Pharaoh, I harden my heart to the task. And the audition on the job actually goes pretty well. And you could probably rate the expedition as being somewhat of a success. And it's after that expedition that Washington essentially has found his replacement for Mifflin. He's found his new quartermaster general in Nathanael Greene. But Greene, at the same time, he doesn't want to, he's a little hesitant to take over that position. He doesn't want to lose his commission as a major general. He doesn't want to lose his line command. And there's also some other parameters that he's concerned about once he takes on the job that are able to iron out. He is able to get a couple of excellent assistants, a fellow named John Cox, who is a Philadelphia merchant, Charles Pettit, who was a former Secretary of State in New Jersey, to be his assistants. And with Washington's promise that he will retain his commission as a major general, retain his division command, he finally, after Congress, in fact, Congress, I think they pass, or they decide in early March of 1778 that Greene will become the quartermaster general. Greene accepts a few weeks later, and he becomes the new quartermaster general.
You're right. And there's actually a great line when he's out on those foraging expeditions that I think might have kind of persuaded even Washington farther to kind of pressure Greene into that quartermaster role. And he says, Greene writes to Washington, in quote, God grant that we may never be brought into such a wretched condition again, end quote. And so Washington's like, hey, if we don't want to be brought into a wretched condition again, don't I have a job for you, Mr. Greene? And so it is true. And Greene, actually, I mean, you mentioned briefly Charles Pettit and who's there, John Cox. Cox, an eminent Philadelphia merchant. He assumes all the responsibility of overseeing purchasing and examining stores that are brought. Pettit receives the task of keeping the books, recording the purchases, and overseeing the cash of the department. Greene also does something that's groundbreaking. He actually kind of goes public, and he actually writes, he puts in local newspapers and stuff, kind of that there's returning the page in the quartermaster department. He takes a media blitz, if you would say, and sends out that, hey, we know there have been discrepancies and people have not been paid, but there's a new sheriff in town, colloquially speaking there. And that actually starts the quartermaster department on a different foot. I mean, Greene obviously is coming in with a shambles of a mismanaged system, but he's also saying that there's simply things that just need attention. He even writes, there have been great losses sustained for want of attention. And Greene understands that. It's just simply getting the right people in the right place. And Cox and Pettit are two of those people. I'm never mispronouncing his name, blame it on the Baltimorean in me that mispronounces half the names. But those are two unsung heroes that I'd like to get mentioned to, because they are the right and left-hand mans of Greene, as Greene is the left-hand man of Washington.
Yeah, and Greene comes in not only at a time when the army is suffering, but we're looking at the calendar. It's now getting on toward the end of March when he accepts his appointment. April's coming, May is coming. That means that both armies are going to begin moving out of their winter encampments. The campaigning season is going to be starting up pretty soon. So Greene really, his responsibilities are really twofold. He has to not only provide for the men at Valley Forge who are still in the encampment while the encampment lasts, but he also has to start reestablishing supply lines, reestablishing lines of communication, and preparing for the upcoming spring campaign, whatever they may come, wherever that might be. So he has, his responsibilities are twofold, and he actually he implements and executes plans that his predecessor Mifflin had left in place, and he reviews the plans with Washington, I believe, also with some of the other officers. He said, "Yeah, this is sound from with what we have. Let's move forward and execute." And the first thing he does, the most important thing he does, is he reestablishes those supply lines. He has those wagons rolling into Valley Forge on a daily basis with those badly needed supplies for the men. But he also, what you see, he is going to do something that he had done after the fall of Fort Washington during the withdrawal across New Jersey. He's going to begin working with his deputies, his assistants, to start setting up magazines and forage depots throughout Pennsylvania to prepare the army, or to prepare to support the army whenever the army leaves Valley Forge. And this is also interesting because we can project this out to when he finally becomes commander of the Southern Department in the fall of 1780, takes over command officially in December of 1780. He establishes supply depots and magazines throughout South Carolina, throughout North Carolina, to support his army. So Greene is not only building on his past experience, but he's going to take the experience during the winter encampment at Valley Forge and project that out into the future when he is back as a full-time field commander.
A great point. And let's 2-second pause. We had a great question come in from Bob Wong. Did Greene compensate the local population with vouchers, continental currency, promissory notes, or combination, or other? I think most of it was promissory notes or continental currency, if I remember correctly there.
Yeah, I think that's correct. But at the same time, the continental currency, that paper script, eventually it's gonna depreciate in value. Whereas, and this is going back to Washington's reasoning for the foraging expeditions in February that he initially sent Greene out on. He'll eventually send Anthony Wayne, as well as Light Horse Harry Lee on. Washington does not want those supplies to fall into the hands of the British, because the British have hard silver specie that they can give that has an appreciative, or is either going to appreciate in value. So that's one of the reasons why things eventually start to go downhill again for Greene as a quartermaster as the years go along, because of the continental script.
No, you're exactly right. And building on that point, I mean, one of the undertold stories, or things we like to remove out of the narrative, is that some of the farmers in Pennsylvania realized that the British paid in hard specie. Americans paid in continental notes that would depreciate, or would only be valuable if the Continentals won. If you're looking at the British ensconced in Philadelphia and this ragtag army of Valley Forge, and you're a farmer in central Pennsylvania whose loyalties are caught between the lines, where are you trading? Well, hard coin always holds its value. One of the other guys I like to mention, and we're going to throw him out, is Clement Biddle.
Yes, absolutely.
And he actually comes up, I think he's the what is it? Let me get his title right. The Commissary General of Cargo, I think is his official title. And he actually established a line of forage depots of various sizes to aid and sustain future movements of the Continental Army. Greene endorses the idea. Greene takes it to Washington. Mm-hmm. Washington endorses the idea. And the goal is to safely store over 800,000 bushels of grain in supply depots situated approximately 15 miles apart from each other. And they're going to send these initially. They don't know, of course, Washington's pale land. They don't know what the British are going to do. Obviously, the British will start to evacuate Philadelphia to head toward New York. But they start calling for depots along the Schuylkill, the Delaware, the Head of Elk in Maryland. So Clement Biddle comes up with this idea. He's also coming up with the idea to actually, let's use the river to move supplies until the depth becomes too low in March, April, or so forth later on. But why do more work going over roads that are treacherous in the winter when you have this nice flowing waterway? So Clement Biddle, I know he doesn't get many shout outs in the history of the American Revolution, but tonight you get your dues, sir.
Yeah, and just to tag off of Phil, what you said, the use of the rivers, the waterborne avenues of advance. Biddle, he establishes those magazines, those supply depots in areas where that are essentially unnavigable to British ships. So they have that additional layer of protection from the enemy. So again, highly endorse the shout out to Clement Biddle. He was certainly very effective, but also lent a great hand to Greene.
And part of the reason that Biddle's idea had such merit is that if you imagine the soldiers suffering, imagine the horses, the Hudson and other ones that are suffering. There's a report that over 700 horses died during the 6 months that the American Army is at Valley Forge. And so you forget that, there are supplies to be pulled, but if you're not feeding the troops, more than likely the horses aren't being fed either. I know it seems like a mundane or obvious comment to make, but it's something that faces a 19th century army that we just, in the 21st century, we got away from. I mean, mechanized movement and so forth, but horses need to eat, horses need to be shod. They obviously are tuned to the weather as well. But as we emerge, of course, Greene was promised by Washington to keep his line commission. He does not go back into a line commission, though, after Valley Forge. He actually labors on as a quartermaster up for another few years. And he actually, Washington's, no pun intended, saves his bacon a little bit because Greene is a little hot-headed. In April 1779, I am more and more convinced that there is measures taken to render the business of the quartermaster's department odious. And if I have not some satisfaction for the committee of Congress respecting the matter, I shall leave to quit the department. And so Greene is not happy being quartermaster general. Washington has to take his unofficial son and keep him from doing something too hot-headed.
Yeah, and part of that goes back to the fact that through the course of the Revolution, the Continental script, again, we talked about it a few minutes ago, the difference between the Continental script of the Americans, of the Continental Army, and the silver of the British. The Continental script continues to depreciate through the course of the American Revolution, but what does not depreciate, what goes up is, I mean, really, it's basic supply and demand. Greene must continue to requisition and supply the Continental Army, but because supplies begin to dwindle, the depreciation value of the dollar, that really brings itself to a sort of a mini crisis where Congress, based on complaints from the various states, actually gives authorization over to the states to investigate Greene's department. Because Congress doesn't believe Greene about how much he's actually having to expend to keep the Army in the field. And this causes, as Phil mentioned, a lot of grief on the side of Nathanael Greene, to the point where he sends his resignation to Congress as quartermaster general. But as events will play out, farther to the south in South Carolina, we just passed the anniversary a few days ago, August 1780, the British Army under Charles Cornwallis defeats an American army under Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden. And go ahead, Phil.
No, I was just about to say, I'm glad you started moving your gaze south, because Don Dale actually said Greene must have felt as though he fell from the frying pan into the fire when he arrived at the South.
No question. And Gates's defeat finds Greene's resignation sitting with Congress. Washington decides that he's going to appoint Greene to command the Southern Army. He's going to relieve Gates. And when Greene arrives in the South in early December of 1780, the viewer mentioned it, frying pan into the fire. He finds that roughly about 75% of his new command is not fit for duty. And you're looking again in the wintertime, albeit a little bit more milder in the Carolinas, but you're looking at the winter of 1780 with Greene taking on again new responsibilities, but at the same time just as important as the responsibilities that he took on at Valley Forge when he became the quartermaster general.
No, you're right. And we had a great comment or question come in from a listener or viewer. How did other low-ranking commissary quartermaster officers like Affirmed Blaine, who was frontline with the regiments and brigades, fare with the shortages and complaints leveled against them? I mean, I hate to use the colloquial, you're between a rock and a hard place, but you are. I mean, they're the ones trying to find supplies, trying to use scripts, trying to, they have even a more personal, I guess, scrutiny to them, because they know these gentlemen if they come up with a regiment or they moved in with the company or so forth. But it's tough when you're using a script that is going up or going down, depending on inflation and worth and value. There are things rotting, there's supply issues, and a lot of there's nothing they can really do. And I want to kind of use an example of a gentleman that Greene uses in the South to kind of is Edward Carrington, who has actually is the unsung hero of, if Greene is the unsung hero of Valley Forge, Quartermaster Edward Carrington is the unsung hero to Greene's basically the race to the Dan. And that is that these gentlemen go behind the scenes to try to figure out where the Army's moving, how to get supplies, where to get the boats, and so forth. And so Blaine and other ones are similar. They're trying to literally make magic out of nothing. And I'll pass it back to Dan to talk about the Southern campaign if you want to add anything with Carrington.
Yeah, Carrington is going to play an integral role for Greene's army during a very critical phase of the campaign. And what Greene is able to do, and just to put it into a nutshell, not go too far down the rabbit hole, but through the course of the winter of 1780, December 1780, up until December 1782, the course of 2 years, Greene is able to essentially fight. He wages a campaign of attrition, a campaign of exhaustion, really a campaign of conquest. You could probably divide those 2 years up into three different phases, but he is able to wear down the British Army in the South. And not only is he able to do that, but he's also able to reduce the various garrisons that have been established throughout South Carolina and Georgia and press the British back to the coast, to the point where they are, by the time of just after the fall or the Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown, the British will eventually only hold Savannah, and Charleston. Savannah will be evacuated first in the summer of 1782, and Charleston will follow later on, December of 1782. So what Greene is able to do in the South is, again, in his Southern campaign, it sort of overshadows what he's able to do as the quartermaster general, but both services are that he renders in both theater or both roles is invaluable. But in the South, is he's able to retain control of North Carolina, South Carolina, eventually Georgia, and hold that to the point where it will not be used as a bargaining chip between the diplomats when they come to the negotiation table after Yorktown. And his ultimate defeat of the British is, I think it might just be, I think it is his greatest accomplishment to the cause of the United States.
Great points there. And we're going to kind of seesaw back and forth as we get some comments in, questions. One of them is, of course, what were the political loyalties of the populations along the counties, Bucks, Chester, modern day Montgomery counties? Were they primarily patriots, loyalists, or neutral? I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, you have a lot of the pacifist type religious sects that are in that part of Pennsylvania. You do have some very leaning patriotic sentiments. There's a report I was just bringing up that I used in some of my research that Bucks County was one of the first ones to try to supply troops to the American cause out of Pennsylvania. Some of you have just basic survival. Both sides, of course, between Valley Forge and Philadelphia are contending for supplies. And so as a farmer there, you have to decide where does your loyalty lie, or where you get hard specie, or where you get continental script, or will you try to hide stuff to survive the winter yourself? And so loyalties obviously are mixed there. Most of the loyalist population would go retreat into Philadelphia, and when the British left Philadelphia, they would obviously leave by land or water. Joseph Galloway, one of the Pennsylvania. I don't know if he was there at the Continental Congress, and then he became showed his true colors as a loyalist, as an example. But Great question there. Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, not too much more I can add to that. I mean, it's definitely an interesting question, and we we might never really know.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I think the best way to explain is what John Adams once said. It was a 1/3 of the population supported the cause of independence. 1/3 supported the loyalists. 1/3 didn't care either way. And so maybe that's the best way to describe it. Throwing Mr. Adams in there to let the primary source speak itself. So we're about 10 minutes from the hour, and so as Nathanael Greene, as we wrap up. Nathanael Greene, what do you see any correlations between his time as quartermaster at Valley Forge and the year or two prior or around it, and how that corresponds to his service in the Southern Theater?
I think it prepares him for what he has to do in the Southern Theater. It makes him look beyond the optics of being just a division commander. He has to now think and adjust to executing on a higher level from an army level now as a quartermaster general. And I think that prepares him for his ultimately being placed in army command in the fall, early winter of 1780. It's just his mindset shifts from one level up as a commander. So he's able to see not just from the division level, but the entire picture. And I think his time as quartermaster helps him do that and prepares him for his time in the South.
I think I'm going to piggyback off that and say exactly. I mean, he actually is a carbon copy of Washington. Lose the battle, but win the war. Someone put it in our comments, Dan and Michael, a tactics of hit and run, a campaign of 1,000 cuts. And that's exactly what Greene does in the South. But at the same time, you look at some of what he does, he understands what's behind him as well. He undergoes a getting the topography of the land, routing the waterways, looking at the one of the most successful retreats in American history, the Race to the Dan, and pulling the Pirate victory at Guilford Courthouse. Greene is unlucky, but he's lucky in a way that he keeps surviving some of these defeats that look like victories, from Hopkirk's Hill to Utah Springs, and trying to mirror Morgan at Cowpens and what he does, Greene at Guilford Courthouse. But unfortunately, and actually, let me back up a little bit. Someone said that maybe one of Greene's best things prior to being quartermaster is endorsing the Marquis de Lafayette. I'm going to throw that comment out just for a little bit of response. Agree, disagree, Dan?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think Lafayette's campaign in Virginia in the spring of 1781 has not been, our friend John Moss has looked at it in detail, but I don't think it gets enough attention from historians, where Lafayette essentially replicates Greene's campaign in the Carolinas, keeping Greene's supply line from Virginia to the Carolinas open, and ultimately waging a campaign of exhaustion against Cornwallis.
There you go. So Greene. So if Greene is the mini me of Washington, then Greene's endorsement of Lafayette is the mini me of Greene. So we can continue like those Russian dolls, piling them down. Unfortunately, though, Nathanael Greene, because of his time as quartermaster general and how well he did, and because of his rescinding of his past, actually ends up retiring, or after the war, settling in Georgia, and he gets land there from this colony or state of Georgia. But unfortunately, he doesn't survive too long. Dan, do you want to wrap up the Greene post-American Revolution?
Yeah, Greene is left destitute. He takes money out of his own pocket eventually to supply his army. He is, in fact, meeting with one of his creditors that he owes a significant amount of money to in Savannah, returning home to his plantation, Mulberry Grove. What we think, he comes down with a bout of heat stroke, and he unfortunately passes away from heat stroke. And Anthony Wayne, Continental Army general, a subordinate of Greene's, who's with him when he passes away, leaves behind, I think, Greene's great epitaph, where Wayne says, he writes shortly after Greene's passing, that I've seen a great and good man die.
Yeah, and then we're gonna test your knowledge here, Dan, real quick. Who someone asked the question, who was the quartermaster general at the siege of Yorktown for the American Army?
I believe it's Timothy Pickering.
Timothy Pickering, or yes, I think you're what I'm looking up, I think you're right there.
Okay.
He's so yeah. And how were supplies, ammunition depots organized there? Do you want to take a crack at it?
I want to say they're being set up similar to how, and I have to go back and take a look at this, but based on experience, they're probably being set up similar to how they were set up shortly after Valley Forge and how Greene utilized them in the Southern campaign. But again, that's something I'd have to go back and do a little bit more digging into as to how Lafayette and Baron von Steuben handled their supply lines of communication in 1781.
Yeah, so Bob, we hope we answered a little bit of your question there about who the quartermaster and so forth was. Of course, depots, obviously the American and French armies can use the French Navy. You have the town of Williamsburg, of course, all the way up now that the British have moved out, Richmond and so forth. So you do have a little bit of more of a structure probably put in place. Obviously, as Washington has examined what Greene did up at Valley Forge. So before I have closing remarks, any last comments, thoughts, questions, anything, Dan?
This was really enjoyable. I appreciate you all having me back. This was a fast 55 minutes. I don't know where the time went, but this has been great.
Oh no, it when we start doing these revelries and an hour seems like a few minutes, you're having fun. So we thank everyone. Great comments, suggestions, and comments, questions in the chat. Now we will be back. This is the last one in August, so we'll be back on around Labor Day weekend. Let me bring it up. We are going actually back and having an evening with David L. Preston, who wrote the book Braddock's Defeat. So we're going to talk about Washington as a junior officer before he becomes the Continental Army commander. So great book. If you haven't read it, you have a few weeks to read it. If not, you can listen to a synopsis there by David Preston there on September 4th. So 2 weeks from tonight. However, as we move into September, we're about 1 month away from the next Emerging Revolutionary War Symposium held in historic Alexandria, world turned upside down, using the quote from Yorktown, segueing there. Tickets are still available. We have some great speakers talking about the French or John Adams' international diplomacy, or even the Russian influence in the American Revolution. And in about 3 months, we have a few tickets, I think a handful left, for this Emerging Revolutionary War second annual bus tour that will look at the American Army and the creation of that. And we'll do Valley Forge and Monmouth. For those tickets as well, please head over to emergingrevolutionarywar.org and secure your tickets to join that bus trip November 11th through 13th, 2022. So with that, for Dan, thank you for joining us again. Always a great pleasure. Dan and I have had many of a fireside chats talking about things of this nature. We only made one reference to the American Civil War, so I think that was good for us for an hour. So thank you for tuning in here tonight. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks when we talk with David Preston, Braddock's Defeat, and the French and Indian War. Be safe and have a great rest of your August, everyone.
Bye-bye.